Well, I want to welcome you to this discussion we're going to have today. My name is Dr. Patrick Arbore, and I'm the founder and director of the Center for Elderly Suicide Prevention and Grief-Related Services. Some of you might be familiar with our 24-hour accredited crisis intervention hotline, warm line, which is called the Friendship Line. And our Friendship Line has been in operation since 1973. And the Friendship Line was really the bedrock for it, was wanting to reduce loneliness and social isolation in older people, their caregivers, or younger disabled. And we were very aware even back then in the early 70s that loneliness and social isolation had a relationship to suicide and suicidal ideation. And so we believed at the time, and still believe today, that if we can reduce loneliness and social isolation, just a noticeable difference, that might impact the caller's thinking about despair or hopelessness or depression. And what we want to do is just make a noticeable difference, just a noticeable difference. And we've learned a lot over the years through our callers about loneliness and social isolation. And I think that's hard for us to really think about because most of us are connected to people, and we're calling people, emailing people, texting people. And so we don't necessarily understand what it means to be so lonely or so isolated. And one of when we look at the scope of this problem, for example, the data from Pew Research Center from 2016 suggested that older Americans, who have been living alone has been decreasing since about 1990. And this change was largely because women between the ages of 65 and 84 are increasingly likely to live with a spouse, because we see that, in terms of our demographics, people are living longer. And where women have tended to outlive men, that's been changing somewhat in terms of looking at the data. And, or they might live with their children, which has been kind of a change from before. And so the likelihood of living alone has grown since 1990 for two groups of people. One is older men, and another is for women 85 plus. And when we look a little bit more, dig a little deeper into this, what we see is that more than 1/4, or 27% of women aged 65 to 74 lived alone in 2014. And that is, kind of consistent with the data that, we're kind of not as isolated as we had been before 1990. And then the share jumped to 42% among women aged 75 to 84. But where the change really happened, as I said a few seconds ago, was among the 85 plus group, the older old women. And that share jumped to 56% of women 85 and older who find themselves living alone. But that might not be due to choice, but it might be due to circumstances. And then, as I said, the number of Americans aged 65 and older is projected to grow from approximately 46 million today to, I think, about 90 million by 2060. And so things are really shifting, and it's something that we really want to think about is, as the population ages, what we might find just in terms of numbers, more people who may be living alone, despite the fact that we are living longer. And we need to kind of think about this a little bit. So what we're going to be talking about is loneliness. So what is loneliness? Well, as you're listening, it may be that loneliness hasn't really affected you, maybe since you were in graduate school somewhere and you didn't have a date or friends or whatever in the beginning. But it's one of the big dreads of our time. And so as we work with individuals who are older, we really need to be sensitive to, how lonely are they? And when you're experiencing yourself as fragmented, or incomplete or invisible, And what we want to think there is ageism. That if you're walking down the street and you aren't seen by people, that might really impact your capacity and desire to go out and participate in life. And that feeling of invisibility is also connected to self-doubt. And so what we've seen certainly through the friendship line is that a lot of people are just unwilling to participate anymore because they feel like they don't belong. And we're going to be talking about that more. And so what they experience now is this feeling of aloneness. And it's not as solitude, but it's really of loneliness. And many of you listening might say to yourselves, well, I live alone, but I really like my solitude. I enjoy my company. And that's more of a choice. I'm choosing that. But for a lot of people, the living alone is a result of the death of a partner or death of a spouse. And so it's different. And loneliness can affect, right now, millions of Americans, either acutely or chronically. And again, depending upon the circumstances, loneliness might be a temporary experience because I've had a surgery or knee replacements or something, but it could also be quite chronic. And so what we want to do is to think about assessment, that we need to really inquire about this. Everyday loneliness is painful when people are isolated from family members and or friends. Many times older people, particularly in the 85 and up age group, will say, I turned around one day and my family and friends have either died or disappeared. And that's very disturbing. And I don't even know, many times they'll say, how to reach them. I don't know where they went. But loneliness can be described as a gnawing chronic disease without redeeming features. And that is so, I think, descriptive of so many older people that I've talked to over the years, where there's something really eating away at them, and they have a hard time with that. The other thing that we want to think about when it comes to assessment too is just because someone lives with a partner or a spouse or adult children, that doesn't necessarily mean they're not lonely. And I think in our kind of task-driven society, where we're very kind of quick to do an interview with an older person, that when they say that, oh, I've lived with my husband or spouse or partner for 40 years, that I think we have a tendency to just assume that that means you're not lonely. But as Germaine Greer wrote many years ago, loneliness is never more cruel than when it is felt in close propinquity with someone who has ceased to communicate. And you might have a sense of that just in your own lives if somebody that you're dating or living with gives you the cold shoulder. It doesn't feel good. And if that goes on for 40 years, that's going to be very challenging and disturbing. Hockley and associates propose that there are 3 dimensions to loneliness, which includes isolation, connectedness, and belongingness. Loneliness has been linked to physical illness, alcoholism, and suicide. And so, part of the reason for doing this particular discussion today and this topic is to really help us see the connection between loneliness and isolation and these other problems that might emerge, particularly when we think about belongingness. If you don't feel like you belong, you might really start thinking that what's the point, what's the purpose of being here? And then in an ageist society, it's very easy, as I said earlier, to just slip through the cracks because nobody's so interested in you anymore. Lonely individuals have been found to express pessimistic views, to be low in positive affect, and more likely to be shy and withdrawn. And so at senior centers or assisted livings or just out in the world, we might not be drawn to that older person who's sitting there with their head down and not engaging. But that older person who is smiling and talkative and extroverted and has community, those are who we're drawn to. And so I really urge us all to think about, older people that are somehow in your orbit and be able to say hello to them, and take a risk ourselves, and that can be helpful. As I said, some people prefer solitude, and when we are engaging in a conversation with an older person and you learn that they live alone, that you want to talk to them about that. Is this something that you chose, as opposed to this happened to you? And I think that starts a really important conversation. But we want to keep in mind that loneliness itself is highly subjective. And as you're listening to this, I hope you're asking yourself, how do you define loneliness? Have you had periods in your life when you felt alone and that it didn't feel good? And so it's important for us to kind of, think about that. Loneliness makes a person vulnerable to different situations. For example, depression or use of drugs. Anxiety might be part of that, because in our society, people, I think, are very reluctant to say that they're lonely, because we equate loneliness with being a loser, like there is something wrong with you. And to some degree, there is something wrong, but it's not about who they are, it's these circumstances that have happened to them. And so I think we have to look at our countertransference and ask ourselves, how do I think about loneliness? And that's part of the reason why we're doing this discussion today. Loneliness has also been acknowledged as a serious public health issue, and it has significant impact on the quality of life of older adults. And again, when we think about, that this age group of older adults is going to be living longer, and we know the 85 plus age category is the fastest growing age category in America today, and has been so for some time. And the second fastest growing age category is the 100 plus. And so when I say this, that anybody who's watching this or listening has the probability, at least when we think about statistics, that you might live well into your 80s, possibly your 90s, and maybe into your hundreds. And are you saying to yourself right now, Yahoo! I've got all this time, and see, and again, I think that this is what is so challenging for older adults, and particularly in their 80s or 90s, is that we don't want to be who they are, because we have a negative connotation about that, and we know that ageism will say older people are lonely and they're not active and they have these, rigid thoughts and beliefs, and they're cranky, and yet we want to serve them. And I think that's very challenging for us if I wouldn't want to be they. And I think we have to work through that, and that's very important. So when we look at the problems that contribute to loneliness, what we see, again, it includes ageism, and loss of mobility, and losses of all different kinds. Also, hearing loss and blindness, among other factors. And so I really believe that there are reasons why this is happening. Another example, a vignette, is I had met this gentleman. He was 92 years old. I didn't know that at the time. And I was giving a talk, ironically, on communications among older people. And there were about 70 older people, 65 and plus, at this talk. And as I was speaking, people had questions, and this gentleman was right in the front row. And usually I say to people, if anybody has a hearing problem, let me know. I had a microphone, and so I assumed nobody said anything. And so I was giving my talk. And but at one point, somebody over here on this other side of the room had a question, and I turned my body, because I couldn't hear her, and I had to move closer, and then I answered or responded to her question. And then I came back to the center, and this gentleman raised his hand, and he just happened to ask the same question that this lady did. And a gentleman in the back of the room got up, came up to him and said, I hate you. You ruin every discussion, every lecture. You ruin it because you don't pay attention. And, but he said it very, very intensely. And this gentleman got up and just kind of took off. And I could see that he was crying, and I had to follow him. And I went out with him to where he was standing. He was standing by this, where his mail comes. And he pulled out, he had a note in there, he pulled it out and he handed it to me. And the note reiterated what that gentleman said. Don't come to this lecture because you ruin every lecture. And it was really, he was just so upset. And I said to him, I said, what do you think is going on? And he said, I don't want people to know that I can't hear, because people are going to think you're old and not want anything to do with you. And I did say to him, I said, well, how old are you? And he said, well, I'm 92. And he said, hearing aids don't work for me. And you know, I am just stone deaf. I can't hear a thing. But he said, I rely on lip reading. And he said, I don't know exactly what happened in there, but he said, did he do something wrong? And I said, you didn't do anything wrong. You just happened to ask a question that somebody else had asked. And he was just so distraught. And he said to me, he said, because part of what I had been talking about was loneliness. And he said to me, you'll never really understand the kind of fierce loneliness that I experience, because people do not want anything to do with you if you can't hear. They don't want to take the time. And he said, I just don't like saying it. And it was just really a painful thing. And so, you know, I had to go back and say something to them, which was not easy to do, but we did get some resolution in there. He didn't come back. And then I had our social worker come and meet with him. But it was really important to hear what he described himself as fiercely lonely because of the hearing loss. And so this insidious or fierce loneliness is the kind of loneliness that makes you feel like you are really alone in the world, very isolated. And that's what he felt. And he later moved from that particular independent living situation because he didn't feel he could really survive there in a healthy way. And this insidious loneliness that he was experiencing occurs because we think it may or may not be true that no one really gets how much suffering we are experiencing that's connected to this feeling of loneliness. And that's where I think we have to think about compassion and empathy and, you know, really being able to connect in a real way. You know, there is this alone feeling that comes when we believe that nobody sees us, nobody understands, you know, what this feeling of loneliness is like, and it's very difficult. You know, hearing loss, as we know, is one of the most common disabilities among older adults. It affects approximately 25 million Americans, half of whom are older than 65. And just as that gentleman was indicating, that his hearing loss really inhibits communication, and it caused him to feel very, very isolated, and that has been very difficult. And for example, compared with a single sensory loss, combined hearing and then vision loss, termed dual sensory loss, further challenges cognitive functioning in older adults and is associated with poorer quality of life, increased depression, and even increased mortality risk. So we want to be very thoughtful when we are, you know, interviewing or counseling or working with or caring for an older adult who may not feel comfortable telling you that they can't hear. And we get that when they say, if you'd only talk louder, everything would be fine. It's you. Rather than them admitting that they have a hearing loss. And the data indicate that older people wait way too long, maybe up to 10 years, before they actually seek some support, because they just don't want to talk about that. Researchers Carney and Associates in a recent article talked again about elder orphans and that they are really a subset of older people that are hiding in plain sight. And we don't really connect with them or understand what that might be like, because generally we don't have any experience with that. And they are living in our communities. They are socially and oftentimes physically isolated without an available known family member or designated surrogate, and sometimes without a caregiver. Those aging alone with limited support is expected to increase as the U.S. population continues to age and people live in the community with more chronic illnesses, because that's the other concern that gerontologists are really looking at, and researchers, is as we're living longer, living into our 80s, well, if we're 40 now, we're not going to be 40 for the next 40 years. We're going to be 50, 60, and 80. And we are technologically, in terms of our medical system, able to kind of manage these chronic health issues. But we might be managing at the age of 90, 5 different kind of problems that might have killed us in our 80s, but because of technology, we survive that. But that doesn't necessarily mean my life is going to have quality. What it might mean is that my life is going to be very lonely. And that's a problem. And again, inclusion in this category is often due to circumstance rather than choice. And so as people age, they often discover too late that they can no longer complete the activities of daily living. And we know if somebody can't manage those ADLs, they might not be able to live independently. And they're going to have to transfer to a different setting, which might not be something that they want to do. And so they may not access the care they need. And then what happens is that they'll wind up having to go to the hospital, usually an emergency room, because things go wrong, because no one is really there helping them look at some of these issues that wouldn't have to turn into an emergency, but does, because nobody's paying attention. And that's a problem, and that's why we want to be able to identify elder orphans earlier through our social service communities, through our medical communities, through our case managers, through our religious organizations, pastors, rabbis, to be able to identify that this person who has nobody might really be in trouble. And that we can do something. Because in this way, elder orphans may be able to maintain quality of life in their communities for as long as possible through creating other kinds of connections, which again is something that Friendship Line has believed in, that connections, are what bind us to life. But the data are pretty clear that you don't need to have a lot of people, but what you want to have is at least, 1 or 2 people that will have a meaningful conversation with you, that it's a significant connection, and, that it's not just, hey, are you okay, goodbye. It's, how are you doing today, and what are you thinking about? And having a conversation. The person is 85. Death might be on their mind, and let's talk about that. Let's talk about issues or concerns that matter. But if we have an ageist attitude that old people are just kind of going down the rabbit hole, we're not even going to attempt to have a conversation. And we've got to change that paradigm. The other thing that we're noticing in terms of the data is that, for example, the older cohort who are in their 80s or 90s now entered old age mostly in a relationship. Many married, but in some kind of a relationship, and they had a source of support. Most older people who require care receive it from a family member. We know that certainly in terms of the data about dementia, that the caregivers are often family members who are trying to care for their loved one before the dementia progresses to something more severe. But when we look at baby boomers, what we see is 1/3 of that population are on the cusp of older age, but are unmarried. And this is really unprecedented. And then we look at who are those unmarried people, and many of them are men. And we know men are especially vulnerable because they are less likely to have access to a reliable form of support. And that might also include not having children. And that's the other thing that we're seeing is that, the older cohort might have had, 5 or 6 children. And so they had options, maybe the daughter lived with them or whatever. But the aging boomers, when they were younger, they weren't so interested in having a lot of children. They might have only had 1 child, or maybe just no children at all. And that makes a difference. In terms of the research, what we're seeing is that divorced and widowed men who were childless had the highest odds of loneliness compared with men in other family relationships and women in all family relationships. So that it's particularly hard on men. And then when we think about, men and suicide statistics, is that men are overly represented in the suicide stats. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Divorced, childless men had the highest odds of depression. And what we also know in terms of our data is that depression, although it's quite prevalent in older people, is often unrecognized and therefore untreated. And yet, depression can be remediated, through pharmacological approach or counseling. And so we've got to dig a little deeper into this because it's a problem. And so divorced, childless, elderly men were approximately 2 times more likely to feel lonely compared with women. And so we know that too, that women are less likely to die by suicide. I think the statistic is that men are usually about 4 times more likely to die by suicide than women. But when you go into the older ages, it might be 15 times more likely for men to die by suicide than women. There was an interesting study done in the state of Michigan. It's their health and retirement study. And their findings suggested that 22% of people over the age of 65 currently are or are at risk of becoming elder orphans. And researchers, particularly Carney and Associates, said it's really important that we find a way to describe this population, because if we can say elder orphan, we start to realize that there's no family there. There's nobody who is going to step up and say, I'm here for this individual. And so we want to be aware of it. And then we want to look at the dimensions of loneliness. Then there are 5 of these dimensions, but one is, as we've been talking about, isolation. And it's a response to conditions that inhibit the ability or opportunity to engage with others. And social isolation is the state of complete or near complete lack of contact between an individual and society. It differs from loneliness, which can reflect, as I said earlier, a temporary lack of contact with other humans, or it can be very chronic. And it can be an issue for individuals of any age, though symptoms may differ by age group. So young people, 24 years of age or less, can be oftentimes very visibly and loud about not having friends or being bored or something like that. Where older people just might shut down and say nothing because they might have internalized ageist attitudes. And then connections is this other dimension of loneliness. And we know that people with high connectedness tend to feel very close with people. They're easily willing to be engaged, at holiday times or picnics or whatever it might be, is that they are willing to participate. They might have to utilize a wheelchair because they have mobility problems, but they're willing to do that because they're very connected and people are wanting to help them. But people with low connectedness tend to feel interpersonally distant from other people and the world at large. That they are going to decline invitations. They're going to say things like, it's just too much work, it's too much effort to get me into the car. I just spoke to a woman the other day, she's 77, and she said because of some mobility problems she's having, that she won't go to her doctor because she knows that her doctor's going to say, you need to use, some devices here. You need a walker or you need a different kind of cane, and she doesn't want to do it. And I said, well, what's holding you back from doing that? And she said, I don't want him to think that I'm old. And we've got to face that. Somebody has to be old, and we don't want to impoverish the meaning of aging by saying things like 80 is the new 60, 70 is the new 50. 70 is 70, and we've got to face the reality and the truth of that. And another dimension, as I mentioned, was belongingness. That feeling that you belong is most important in seeing value in life and in coping with intensely painful emotions. When we feel like we belong to our family, to a professional group, to colleagues at our job site, to a religious, group. We have a role. We know we have a place at the table. But I think it's hard for us to really sit with somebody who is really, really isolated. And that feeling of suffering, I think, is very scary for people who have never really experienced loneliness. I think it's very, very difficult. And a lack of belongingness is a persistent and pervasive experience that is psychologically distressing and potentially debilitating. And another piece of this loneliness is burdensomeness. It's this mental state characterized by conscious perception with full awareness that others would be better off if I weren't here. That I am a burden, And if I walk around thinking this on a regular basis, that I'm a burden, what it means is that I have no worth or value. And if I do have any connection with somebody, they will be better off without me. And so that to me is a cue to say, are you thinking about death? Are you thinking about suicide? And can we have a conversation about that? And what I say to people is when they tell me, well, if I have an adult son or daughter, they'll be better off without me. And I said, well, did you give them an opportunity to vote on that? You're making these decisions, and I'm not sure they would agree. And that turns things just a little bit. And I think that we need to really explore this experience that this older person is having who feels like a burden. And both social isolation and loneliness are associated too with increased mortality. What the data are speaking to us, they're saying that we need to pay attention, because when somebody is really isolated, really lonely, it's affecting not just a psychological part of them, but also this emotional part of them, a spiritual part of them, and a physical part of them. Something is happening that researchers are looking at. And while both isolation and loneliness impair quality of life and well-being, efforts to reduce isolation are likely to be a bit more relevant in the case of severe depression and suicidal ideation. And that's something that researchers have been looking at. Isolation can occur as a result of age or race, culture, frailty, poverty, appearance, that it's just so tragic how lookism is a problem, and that older people, feel so devalued because they don't look like they did at 40. And they just have such trouble with that. And so we see that so many billions of dollars are spent on, hair color and, Botox and facelifts and things like that in a desperate hunt to stay young. And we've got to face that as we see more and more older people in our culture. Isolation can occur as a result of sexual orientation. That older people who are maybe LGBT may have special needs, but they might have also loneliness because of their not being young anymore, or being able to participate as they used to with the people that they have associated with. Isolation increases, again, vulnerability to disease, suicide, and death. One of the researchers that has been doing a lot of work in terms of looking at the relationship between loneliness, social isolation, and premature death is Dr. Cacioppo. And he has found in his research that people who feel consistently lonely have a 14% higher risk of premature death than those who don't. The impact of loneliness, he goes on to say, on early death is almost as strong as the impact of being poor, which increased the chances of dying early by 19%. What Dr. Cacioppo has said in his work is that when we fail to acknowledge loneliness, we fail to recognize what it means to be human. And as social creatures, we are hardwired to connect. And you just think about yourselves that you have probably, again, texted, emailed, called, plans that you're going to see loved ones or family members or talk to them. And it's just, you just take that for granted that this is always going to be there. And I think we forget that that isn't necessarily going to happen for a lot of older people. And that lack, that feeling of isolation is just so painful for a social creature. But because we look at older people in a negative way and say, well, that's just being old, they're going to be alone, we fail to accept them as they are just like us. They just happen to have more birthdays. Older people get their minority status simply because they had more birthdays. And that means all of you that are watching this or listening, you're going to have birthdays too. And so how do you want to shape your life? And what you don't want to do is to have this feeling of an inability to belong, because we're, again, hardwired. We want to connect with people. But if that belongingness is thwarted, we slip into a painful mental state that results because of this fundamental need we have to connect that has been inhibited in some way. Both thwarted belongingness and perceived burdensomeness may indicate the presence of unmet psychological needs, because both constructs have demonstrated concurrent and predictive associations with suicidal desire. Relationships cannot meet the need to belong when the interactions are characterized by perceptions of burdensomeness. So if I feel like a burden, I am not going to reach out to anybody because I believe that they're going to be harmed by me, So the interactions cease to be emotionally supportive because I'm thinking, I want to die, and you would be better off, which is such a justification for suicide, ideation, and death. Dr. Thomas Joyner, who has been very involved in suicide prevention, and he has an interpersonal theory of suicide. He got very involved in suicide prevention as a result of his 56-year-old father who died by suicide. And when he was found, there was a note beside him, and the note said, "Is this the answer?" And so his son then has spent his career trying to figure out where is that risk? Where does somebody go from ideating suicide to actually dying? And so what he stresses is that we want to assess for elevations in thwarted belongingness and or perceived burdensomeness. And that's the ultimate goal underlying the interpersonal theory of suicide. And what we want to really keep in mind is that connections are what bind us to life. And what's really important is companionship and mutual assistance and protection. that if I have someone in my life who really cares about me, I'm going to be more likely to take better care of myself because I have a relationship with that person. Having high quality relationships with a few people is one of the keys to happiness and longevity. And I think what we want to do is really think about these things because it's highly likely that we are all going to live longer. And so how do we want to do that? Do we want to slip into despair, or do we want to really figure out what are those factors that contribute to successful aging? The stresses and challenges of life are more easily endured, as we know, if we can share that with somebody. And we see that on our 24-hour friendship line that people call, and we invite them to call back because what we're forming with them is a relationship. You can count on Friendship Line always being there, and that's important for people to know. So should we screen for loneliness? The answer is yes. And Dr. Cacioppo has utilized the UCLA loneliness scale, a 20-item scale, but also Dr. Parasanato and many other researchers find, particularly when you are working with older people, that the 3-item loneliness scale is just as valid and reliable as the 20-item scale. And you can weave that into a conversation, meaning, ask the person if they ever feel left out of activities. Do they feel isolated at times? And do they lack companionship? Does anybody call them? Does anybody reach out for them? And then you get a picture of an idea that, this person might have a hard time verbalizing how lonely they are, but this way you can at least kind of open the door a little bit and get a picture. Doctors Cacioppo and Hockley, in terms of their research, they have looked at the brains of lonely people and also the brains of non-lonely people. And what they've noticed that the brains of people who are lonely, they detect that the person is on high alert, particularly for social threats. So lonely individuals tend to view their social world as threatening and punitive. And when people will say things like, I have this wonderful program, or there are services in our region or county, and so we talk to people who we might perceive as lonely, and we say to them, hey, there's this really nice community center, they have wonderful activities, and the person is not leaning in as, hey, I'm going to do that. They're really pulling back. And then what we generally call those people are difficult. These are difficult people. They're not, wanting to engage. They're just kind of difficult. And then we kind of have that label on them and we push them aside, rather than understanding that something happens to the brains of lonely people, The very structure of the brain shifts. And so they're on the periphery and they are suspicious. And we know that. We've talked to people like that. And again, I think we have often said, oh, they're just difficult or they're hard to deal with, rather than loneliness has affected them. Lonely individuals also tend to form more negative social impressions of others, so they're not going to be real responsive to you, even though you're kind and compassionate and are talking nicely to them. Their expectations and their attributional reasoning and actions towards others tend to be less charitable. They might be very short with you or irritated with you. And here you are saying, I'm the good guy. I have something to offer that's going to help you, and they're turning me down. So we want to be aware of, again, this relationship between loneliness and social isolation. Dr. Parasanato also talks about this complex relationship between isolation and loneliness, and that the self-perceptions that may not be fully captured just because, as I said earlier, just because somebody lives alone might not give you enough information. And what she suggests, along with other researchers, is that we've got to dig deeper. We've got to excavate a little bit more so that we really get a sense about that person's internal perception of their situation. And certainly the skill that we want to use there is empathy. Don't only rely on their living alone status as to whether they're lonely or not. Living alone may not, in and of itself, equal poor health outcomes. And we have to be very careful about that in terms of women, that we're not making ageist assumptions about women, that if a woman is living alone, she's going to be in bad shape. You know, she might feel the best she's felt in decades, you know, because she likes living alone. And so how do we recognize loneliness? Well, it's often hidden or disguised. The person just might be physically exhausted all the time, uncomfortable, anxious. They might maybe come to some kind of event, but they leave early or they sit in the corner. People may appear restless, uneasy, or uncomfortable. And lonely people tend to choose to stay at home, go back to bed, try to sleep. But the other interesting thing about lonely people's brains are that because they're anxious, they don't sleep well. And so they wake up a lot during the night. So now during the day, they're really tired because they're just not getting what they need. So what are some interventions that we can choose? Well, one is we can ask about loneliness. It has to begin with a conversation. Even Oprah Winfrey has an initiative out that is just say hello, you know. Just say hello. We've got to be able to approach an older person who doesn't look real happy to see us. And that's a challenge at times. And so we want to be able to go up. What I suggest to people is you don't have to do anything more than just say hello. And if there's a seat beside the person, I just sit. And I'll just sit there for a while. And we're just I'm just kind of aware of this individual, and I want them to be aware of me. I'm not going to flood them with questions. And then at some point I say who I am and that sort of thing. And just, you know, have a conversation, not a confrontation, but a conversation. You know, assist the person maybe in keeping contact with people important to them. If they say, you know, because of arthritis or whatever it might be, tremors, I can't write and I don't have a computer, and you know, and can we find a volunteer in the community that could just write a note to people that they care about? You know, explore the nature of loneliness with the person, that we can talk about that. But we've got to make sure that we're not sitting there with ageist assumptions about the individual, that that's just how it is, you know. And then we want to be aware of, is there community support, friendship line? Is there other kind of, you know, friendly visitors, or, you know, senior centers without walls? I mean, and find out what's in the community. So we want to be able to, again, connect with people, you know, facilitate a conversation, you know, care about people. You know, connections are paramount to caring for people who are lonely. Assist them with keeping contact with people who are important to them. And we want to be as present as possible with those individuals, so that we are really, the message to them is, I'm here with you, and that's all I'm thinking about. You know, I'm not kind of surreptitiously looking at my watch to see how I can get out of this situation. But to be able to just be there, you know, because that's what humans do, you know. They want to be together, you know. And so we can also, you know, empathize with people, that there are reasons why this person is lonely. And so we want to ask them is, you know, do you have family? Do you have friends? But again, don't bombard them with questions. And so we want to be, again, aware of this you know, social connectedness. Humans really need to have that. And so we see, like through the friendship line, just the sheer volume of callers that we have, is that something powerful is happening there. And we know that it makes an impact. You know, the Centers for Disease Control has identified as a key strategy for preventing suicidal behavior at all ages is the promotion and strengthening, you know, of connectedness, both at a personal level, at a family level, but also at a community level. There are things that we can do to really support people not slipping into this social isolation. And then what we also have to think about is ourselves, because it's very challenging, to work on a regular basis with older people who are very lonely, very isolated, depressed, despairing, anxious, in ill health. And so we've got to take care of ourselves because we'll be able to provide better service to other people if we take care of ourselves first. And that's not always an easy task for whether we're talking about family caregivers or professional caregivers. Anne Lamott, in her book Stitches, says a really wonderful thing. And she said, in order to take care of ourselves, what is helpful are daily rituals, things that we do on a routine basis, especially walks, even forced marches around the neighborhood, and schedules. We have something to do, having a purpose is very helpful. Whether it's going to work or you're having meals, but especially meals with non-awful people, can be the knots you hold on to when you've run out of rope. And so the message is, if we take care of ourselves, we can be more effective with other people. Thank you.